Hello, friends, and welcome to this edition of the Coming In for a Landing podcast on the Liberty Ballers Podcast Network. I am your host, Paul Hudrick, and I am joined by a very special guest, a former colleague of mine. Now he's doing great things as a senior writer at Sports Illustrated, and that is, of course, the great John Gonzalez. John, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me. You look wonderful, handsome, talented, rested, all of these things.
Yeah, rested. Ooh, that's surprising because obviously, baby in tow. It's a little surprising that I look rested.
You're defying all the odds, bud.
It must be a dad glow thing. I don't know. Maybe that's what it is.
But, that's exactly what it is.
And this is super exciting because obviously you were the first guest ever on the Coming In for a Landing podcast. So,
which again, honored.
Yeah.
So glad to be back.
Yeah. So it's pretty cool that now Liberty Ballers, here we are, a place that you have, some connections to. A lot of the people that were the great people that came before me at Liberty Ballers, you have a connection to. So it's very cool.
What a murderer's row of grads from Liberty Ballers. I mean, that roster has really produced some killers.
It's serious, like just lightning in a bottle times during the process. And it was good times. And we're trying to keep that going and keep those traditions, but also bring it up a little bit. And I think so far so good. I think we still have some tremendous people, and I'm very excited about that. And I'm going to bring up some of their stuff as we talk about some of these topics today. Obviously we're going to talk about James Harden, and you and I haven't spoken since the trade, so I'm very curious to know your reaction to everything, and then of course just what that means, how he fits, what adjustments Doc Rivers has to make, some of the players have to make. And then, of course, Danny Green had some very interesting comments today about Ben Simmons.
He sure did.
And that saga is just going to continue, I believe, through March 10th and beyond that. So good times. But yeah, let's start with the obvious. It's been almost 2 weeks now since James Harden has officially been a Philadelphia 76er. So for you, just your reaction, I guess your reaction to like the lead up too, because this all seemed to happen kind of quickly. Was going to be a sign and trade. Then there's whispers that it might happen at the trade deadline. Then there's no negotiations. Then there's a ton of negotiations. And now he's a Sixer. So for you, like the emotion of the lead up and then to the moment it actually happens.
Surprising, right? I mean, because exactly what you said, 2 weeks out, nobody was really talking about it as a possibility. We were kind of discussing it. There were some people who were kind of hinting at it. And then a week out is when it really started to ramp up. And I thought, well, trading two guys of this caliber for each other with just like a week's worth of runway doesn't seem like you're going to be able to get that plane off the ground. So I was skeptical. I didn't think that it was going to happen. I talked to one of your former Liberty Ballers, creators / Mount Rushmore guys, Mike Levin from the Rights to Ricky. And he always said, like from the beginning, he's like, I think it's going to happen. And I was like, I don't know. I think you're being a little Pollyanna-ish about this. And then sure enough, Daryl Morey gets it done. So my reaction was huzzah. Because look, Ben Simmons clearly did not want to be there and they weren't getting anything for him or from him. And so to get somebody of James Harden's ability into a spot where you were getting a zero from Ben Simmons, that's a huge win. Yes, I know that you have to give up Seth Curry and Andre Drummond in that move. So you do lose that production, but that's a swap you'll make every day.
Right. And that's been what's weird to me is I don't know if it's just people like, to borrow a term, like both siding it in the national media of like, oh man, I think the Nets really won this trade. And I'm like, I don't see how I could see how this trade could help the Nets. And I could certainly see how Ben Simmons fits in, how Seth Curry and Andre Drummond make that team that isn't very deep, makes them a little bit deeper. So first round picks are never a bad thing to have in your bag for a team that just gave up a ton of first round picks to get James Harden. So I get how there's benefits to the Nets, but like the people who are just like flat out saying, yes, the Nets won this trade, I think is kind of crazy. And then to kind of go a little bit longer down that line, like, and I'm a person who's defended Ben Simmons an awful lot and still thinks he is a hell of a basketball player that can offer a lot to even a championship level team. I don't know where he is or what he is right now, right? I mean, I think that's a fair way to look at it.
That component of it is right. I think you don't know what to expect from him until he gets back on the court and we see what kind of shape he's in, what his game looks like, how he's feeling mentally. But to your earlier point about like sort of poo-pooing the Nets side of it, I disagree. This is one of those rare trades where I think everybody wins. I think it's an
disagree.
awesome thing for James Harden because James Harden didn't want to be there. And yes, he and Joel Embiid are both very high usage rate guys, and it's going to be interesting to see how they fit next to each other. And there's probably going to be some standing and watching the other guy do their
We'll
thing.
get to that.
I still think it's going to be good. I don't want to rush it. I'm not hosting this podcast. I'm just a guest. But the other side for the Nets, same deal, right? Where all of a sudden James Harden doesn't want to be there. Ben Simmons didn't want to be in Philly, so he goes to the Nets. And I think if they get the Ben Simmons, I've said this on multiple podcasts, I will now say it on yours. If they get the Ben Simmons who does all the things that he does well, running the break, rebounding, passing, switching 1 through 5 on defense, he could be their version of Draymond Green. And if he's willing to play the Draymond Green role next to Kyrie and KD, he's going to be incredible. If, on the other hand, he wants to be, I'm the point guard, Ben Simmons, I need the ball in my hands all the time, less incredible. But I think there's a world where he's so happy to get out of Philly and pair with these guys and really put the team together that you could see a really good version of Ben Simmons. So I like it both ways.
No, I think that's a fair way to look at it. Like, I think both teams, and even Adam Silver said that when he was asked about tampering. He's like, well, I think both teams and everybody seems pretty happy with how it ended. So, like,
what's the big
deal?
What
are we going to argue here? Like, what are we even going to investigate? Everyone seems happy. Our good friend, Coach Jim Lynam, always compared Ben Simmons, and now I think he's got a really good opportunity to fill that to Scottie Pippen. And I could kind of see that. I mean, clearly Scottie Pippen could hit a jump shot. So, like, let's get that out of the way. But I think the other things of, Scottie as a ball handler, Scottie as an elite defender, extremely versatile defender who, played kind of second fiddle to Michael Jordan. I mean, so now Ben Simmons can kind of play third fiddle offensively to those two other guys you mentioned. And I do think a great fit next to Kyrie Irving. I mean, right? Kyrie is a point guard in name only. He's a 2 guard that's just small. So now you have Ben Simmons, who is a jumbo-sized point guard. And I think that is an excellent fit. And at Durant, I mean, if you can't play with Kevin Durant, you kind of can't play with anyone. But I could just certainly see a role with him, screening and rolling, hitting guys in the corners off those short rolls, guys like Seth Curry, who he apparently doesn't get along with. But we'll get into that in a moment. Right. But first, you kind of already touched on it, but they're certainly Joel Embiid, the most dominant post player in the NBA, most dominant big man. You could argue Jokic, whatever, but it's right now. I don't know if anyone's going better than Joel Embiid at any position, really. And then you look at James Harden, who is historically one of the greatest perimeter players we've ever seen. So when you look at it like that, great. Looks like a match made in heaven, perfect on paper. But I think to what your other point is, high usage rate. And then also when you look at the players that they have played with and where they've had their most success, James Harden clearly does better with rim running, lob threat centers, kind of like a Willie Cauley-Stein, who is now with the Sixers on a 10-day deal. And then Embiid has historically done better when it's kind of that 4 out, when it's just surrounded by catch and shoot guys. And James Harden, never been a catch and shoot guy. Joel Embiid, never really been a big roller. He's done more of it this year than he's ever has, from what I can remember. I don't have any numbers to back that up. But, clearly with Maxey in the fold, he's been a little bit more willing to do that. And it's gotten him some easier looks. So I guess from your perspective, just what do you see? Like, do you think both guys just kind of say like, hey, like we have a really good chance to win a championship? So Joel says, all right, James, you want me to roll more? I'm going to roll more. Joel says, hey, I kind of need you sometimes to just stand and either hit an open 3, catch and shoot, or cut to the basket. Like, do you think one or the other needs to adjust more? Do you think both of them just kind of meet each other in the middle? Like, how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, right? Because of all the reasons that you just outlined, where, James Harden is really great with a roll man, and Joel Embiid in his career hasn't always been that guy. I mean, he much prefers to pop out into space, right? He's a pick and pop guy more than a pick and roll guy, but which doesn't mean he can't do it. Yeah, I think that he would be fantastic at doing it. We just have to see if they're actually going to do it that way. The other thing that I think is interesting and something to watch is, look, ultimately there's going to be some time where they're going to have to feel each other out. Probably you're going to see some moments when Joel Embiid is doing his thing and James Harden is just sort of standing around, and then the opposite will be true when James Harden is doing his thing and Joel is just kind of standing around. But the part that I want to watch is how Doc Rivers deploys them in the game, because as we all know, Doc is often reluctant to stagger guys, right? his rotations.
You're like, it's like, did I don't think I sent you a copy of the role of what we were going to talk about today.
Rundown.
But, and yeah, I don't think I sent you a rundown, but anyway, continue.
So I'm just ruining your rundown, but
it's okay.
I just keep thinking about, this is going to be on, because you're going to start them together, and obviously they're going to finish games together. But in between is what I want to. There should never be a moment in those second and third quarters when one of them isn't on the court.
You say that.
I mean, it just seems obvious, doesn't it, that they should stagger these minutes? Because again, you just mentioned all the reasons why maybe staggering them makes sense, because James Harden and Joel Embiid are so usage heavy, and there's such matchup nightmares in their own respect, right? So it would just seem to me this would be the obvious move, that in the middle of the game you're staggering one and resting the other, and then you're bookending them together at the beginning and the end of the game. But
yeah, and I don't want to look too far into a 10-day signing, but I felt a little bit like signing a guy like Willie Cauley-Stein, who just seems like the prototype guy that James Harden has had in the past, that he has done really well with as that pick and roll guy. It almost seems to hint that staggering might happen, right? Like, because when Joe sits down and Cauley-Stein comes in, that's when James Harden can cook and have that rim running big. I, again, might be reading too far into a 10-day deal, but it just seemed to be that. And maybe that's me being an uber optimist, because as we know, Doc Rivers, with the staggering, with the rotational thing, not always great. I think everyone here was just begging him to stagger Maxey and Embiid while Maxey was going so well. And while him and Maxey, Embiid and Maxey were kind of still figuring things out together, maybe staggering that so Maxey can kind of cook with the bench. He didn't really see that happen. So let's hope that that's kind of the case here. Now that Maxey and Embiid seem to actually be playing better together and kind of figuring each other out, let them play together. Maybe let Tobias and Harden play together a little bit. We'll see. But it doesn't hurt to have two guys who you can stagger like that, who basically it's cool, Embiid and whoever the four are, and then Harden and whoever the four are. And I think you like your chances with that. Speaking of Maxey, how do you kind of see those two? Because it's, Maxey's really developed as a point guard. That's not his natural thing. His natural thing was a scoring guard. That's what he did more of at Kentucky. And he had to play with other point guards. And he kind of adjusted his game, Ashton Haggins and Emmanuel quickly, and he was more off the ball. This year with Ben out, he's really grown as a point guard. You see some of the passes he makes, some of the reads he makes, and it's just a lot of growth in that area. But, it seems pretty clear that Doc's intention is James Harden is our point guard. That's how we're going to play it. So I guess, how do you see those two fit in together? Or do you think it's kind of natural because of like what I just, talked about with Maxey already kind of that being a strength of his playing off the ball?
Yeah. I mean, I almost brought this up and cut you off, but I'm learning as we go, right? Because I was like, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Maxey, but I waited. So
I appreciate that.
Look at me. That's called growth. I would say that probably, Maxey's minutes are probably going to take a hit, right? And that's a bummer for Maxey, but a plus for the team, because you're gaining James Harden. And then now all of a sudden that backup point guard duty that was sort of void when Tyrese Maxey was the main guy. Now you've got an awesome backup point guard and a guy who has really taken a huge step forward this season. So depth-wise, it's just such a win for the team. For Maxey, I think that he's the kind of kid. I don't know him. I haven't met him or talked to him. I just have watched from afar and admired him. And he just seems like the kind of kid who's going to handle this really well, right? Because the way that he handles himself, the way he comports himself in media interviews and around his teammates, and like Joe needling him and teasing him and like constructive criticism, he seems to absorb all that really well. And then plus to be able to play with and learn from James Harden at that point in his development, that to me seems like something he'd be eager to do. So I think this is going to be good for him and the team. But yeah, we're probably going to see his minutes scale back a little bit.
Not to go too far into this, but like when you see Ben Simmons and you see Tyrese Maxey, and they are kind of the antithesis of each other, because you're 100% correct. Like Maxey is so amenable, and he takes, like, Doc has coached him. He's admitted he coaches him hard. He did it last year as a rookie. He's doing it again this year as he developed into a point guard. You mentioned Joel Embiid kind of just ribbing him a little bit in the media sessions, but yeah, I mean, he takes coaching extraordinarily well. He takes it with a smile on his face. He wants to be great. He wants to get better. And I agree. I think, and you already saw it like that. It was wild to watch that Bucks game. The Sixers I think, were down 12 at that point in the second quarter. Doc calls a timeout. Harden gets in Maxey's ear. Maxey rips off like 10 straight points. And you're like, okay, what the hell was that conversation? Because something went off. So it's just, I do agree with you that learning from a guy like Harden is just going to help Maxey infinitely. Speaking of Ben Simmons, we're going to touch more on him after the break. And also, John, I want to get your take on the starting five and how you kind of see that playing forward. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more with John Gonzalez right after this. All right. And we are back. And John, before we get into the Ben Simmons stuff, I want to talk to you a little bit about the starting five. We had our Jackson Frank, who does an awesome job for us at Liberty Ballers. He wrote a piece today discussing the idea of how the Sixers should deploy it. Should they go all offense, kind of like what you saw against the Bucks, where he started George Niang and just said, screw it, we'll have Tobias Harris guard a three and just go all in on offense? Do you maybe need to be more wary of some perimeter threats and start Matisse Thybulle, despite his really big time offensive deficiencies? Or do you kind of go Danny Green, who is a little bit older, more tread on the tires, has had a lot of injury struggles over the last year and a half here, to kind of maybe get a little mix of both as a spot up shooter and a decent defender, though again, as we discussed, a little bit long in the tooth. So when you look at the starting five, who do you think is the best kind of fit, or do you think that maybe Doc should experiment a little bit and maybe rotate those three guys out and give it all a look?
I'd like some experimentation until you end up landing on something that's really clicking, because there's two guys you're starting and then the other three are questions, right? I mean, I think in theory you'd want to start Tobias because of the caliber of player he is. However, getting some juice from him off the bench, where like you need some offensive punch. I know it hasn't been the greatest season for Tobias, and probably he would tell you so, that it hasn't gone the way that he wanted or hoped, but he's still a really good player offensively. I'd like to see him get to the rim more. You don't agree?
No, I do. I'm sorry. It was a little cough. I apologize.
No, I wasn't sure that if you're like, nah, I'm in the get rid of him camp. And I get that the contract situation with him makes it more complicated, but I just think he's better than we've seen from him this season. And
he's been better lately too. Over the last, I think since January 1st, I think he's like 50, 40, 90 almost since January 1st. So
and that's the kind of guy, right? That's the kind of guy he could be. So how they deploy that is interesting, right? Because I suspect when Joe and Harden are both out there at the same time, not a lot of looks for Tobias probably. Maybe some on those, driving kicks where Harden's looking for somebody on the perimeter, and he's such an incredible passer that I think a lot of these guys like Korkmaz and Yang and Tobias are going to get some really easy three looks, which will be good. But yeah, those three in the middle there, to start games, experiment a little bit until you find something.
No, and I agree with you on Tobias. I actually think in a weird way, this is going to really help Tobias, because I think what he needs most is space. To your point, he's really good at that mismatch. Like if he's got a bigger guy on him, kind of blowing by him, if he's got the little guy on him, taking him, to the weight room and kind of hitting those mid-range jumpers or getting some kind of little runner or something like that. I think the space that he's going to get with Harden and Embiid now getting so much attention, I think that could actually really help him. I think he could play really well. And I think pressure-wise, right? Like he's the third guy. I mean, and I don't think he doesn't have an ego like that, where I don't think he's worried about now I'm pushed out. I think he's good with being that. I mean, he was the fourth guy here, right? When Jimmy Butler was here, that was kind of the hierarchy when he first arrived. So I don't think he will have any issue kind of taking that role. And I do think you're right. When they go to that bench unit and, let's say it's Harden that he's playing with, you could see that working out well. Now, the other thing to that is if you want Tobias playing more with the bench guys, it might make more sense to kind of start Niang and then go from there. I agree with you that I think it should be, Doc's got to experiment. To me, Danny Green's probably the best, but I just don't know, health-wise, he has just really struggled. Like I said, basically since the middle of last year, he had the hip issue, had the calf issue that took him out for the rest of the series last year. This year, he's been up and down out of the lineup all year long. So, yeah, I'm very curious to see what Doc does. But as we discussed, Doc, is super creative and not rigid at all with his rotation. So I'm
Yeah,
sure
it'll go great. I'm sure that he'll mess around and just stumble into something.
I'm sure it'll go swimmingly. Lastly, because we have to talk about it, and look, I don't want to wade too far into the waters of, because I think you and I both have a great appreciation for mental health, and we don't want to demean anyone or lessen what someone else was going through. So I don't want to get too far into that. But with the Ben Simmons stuff, now you're seeing today, Danny Green goes on his podcast and says Ben was not very cordial with Seth Curry and Andre Drummond, the two players he was traded to Brooklyn with. Not surprising with Drummond, considering he literally never played with Drummond. A little surprising, I guess, with Seth Curry. When Seth talked during training camp when Ben wasn't there, I got a I don't give a shit vibe from Seth Curry as far as when he was asked about Ben. He just was kind of, well, he's not here, so I don't care. I'm playing because he's not here. That is what it is. And the fact that he's already saying he doesn't think Ben's going to show up on March 10th, which to me, I feel like the more that noise happens, the more likely it is that Ben will play. Just my 2 cents. Then you also get videos today, Kyle Korver working with Ben Simmons. I'm sure that'll just fix everything overnight. I don't even know what I'm asking here. I guess just the idea, the Philly sports fan as well as any person around, as well as any media person there is. I will say, I think it's fair for Philadelphia fans to not feel good about Ben Simmons, how it ended, how his tenure here went. I think there's certainly room for boos, without crossing the line, right? I think there is a lot more nuance to this conversation than just, oh, well, you have to be nice to Ben Simmons because he went through some stuff, as opposed to looking at his entire career here and a lot of the things that went wrong, and a lot of it that, quite frankly, was probably self-inflicted from Ben Simmons.
I mean, look, the Ben Simmons conversation is complicated, right? And to the mental health component, I just talked about this on my podcast, Sports Illustrated Weekly, available wherever you get your podcasts. Please listen, subscribe. I just was talking to Katie Nolan about this. And Mike Golick Jr. had tweeted out something like, none of us know what's going on with Ben Simmons, and none of us are equipped really to evaluate it. Not a hot take. People were all over his mentions. People were all over my mentions, because I love Philadelphia and Philadelphia sports fans. But there was this conflation of, hey, by saying let's not judge him on his mental health stuff, that somehow it was an indictment of Philly sports fans. No, look, you want to criticize Ben Simmons for what happened on the court or what didn't happen on the court, or him disappearing in the Atlanta series and passing up the dunk and not wanting to go to the line. That is all fair game. All I'm saying is maybe let's all fall back on the mental health stuff, because we don't know. And all we know is that whatever happened, he had decided that he was willing to potentially forfeit $20 million, which is a point that Pablo Torre had made, in order to not play in Philadelphia. That sounds to me like he didn't want to work for his employer anymore, and he really wanted to get out. And I've worked at a lot of places, and sometimes you just don't want to work there anymore. And I don't know that makes him a bad guy. I don't know him personally. And I hope whatever's going on with him mentally resolves itself, and then he's good to go mentally. And then beyond that, I wish him nothing but ill on the basketball court. I want not a single point, rebound, assist, anything for him when he plays the Sixers. I hope to God that he does play in the March 10 game, because Paul, oh my God, what will that be like? That will be can't miss television.
Right. And that's what it is. With all due respect, there are plenty of things with Ben Simmons that you can criticize that are basketball related, that you just don't have to go there, right? You just don't have to. You don't need to. If he misses a free throw, you want to just boo him and cheer when he misses. Great. That's wonderful. You should do that. That is what Philadelphia is all about. But just don't don't cross the line. I think that's a very valid, fair thing. Yeah, I think it's cut and dry, that easy. And the one thing I'll say that I didn't like, and there's really none of us know, like you said, the mental health thing, none of us know that. And none of us know how much was when you heard all this chatter during the offseason about, him maybe not getting along with Joel Embiid, or blaming Joel Embiid for certain things, or blaming Doc Rivers for certain things, or whatever. how much of that was real, how much of that was from his camp, how much of that was just Rich Paul said, like Ben Simmons saying to Rich Paul, get me the hell out of Philadelphia. I don't care how you do it. And Rich Paul said, say less. And that's what came of it. Like, I don't know. But to me, like, that's the thing that kind of, like, if I'm going to say like this whole saga, what has ruffled me, I didn't like that there was a lot of negative things said about Joel Embiid from Ben Simmons' camp. And I just don't know. I guess I just don't know where that comes from. And I get Joel Embiid said some less than flattering things, that I'm not a babysitter quote, and I get all that. But I also think Joe was operating from a place of, he doesn't want to be here, so I don't want to talk about it, and we're all moving on. So, but I think the bottom line here is, as we already talked about at the top, everybody wins, right?
Yeah, I mean, everybody wins. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, and you mentioned, and this is important, like, people go, I wonder if we should check into the tampering, right? Like, the Sixers might have tampered here. And Adam Silver went, I don't know, everybody seems pretty cool with this. So maybe that's just what it is. Maybe it's, look, whether he got along with Seth Curry and Andre Drummond or Joel or whomever, he wanted to move on. And the Sixers decided, hey, we can get James Harden, and like, let's just all move forward on this. Now, that said, prior to this, I would wager that Sixers fans cared not at all about the Nets and Nets fans, and that the Nets fans, all seven of them who might exist, hadn't really thought much about the Sixers. Wow, what a fun Insta rivalry we have now. Because at some point, unless he sits out in perpetuity against the Sixers, he will play against them. And even if he doesn't play against them in the Wells Fargo Center, Brooklyn is not far, and Sixers fans are maniacs, and they will go there. And I want all of it. Like, give me all the smoke.
Well, as someone pointed out to me, he's not going to sit out playoff games. So if they play in a series, right, that's going to be ample. That will be a lot of fun. Yeah, and it's fun to bring back a rivalry, because we don't really, it's not a thing like as much in the NBA, at least not from like Sixers perspective. Like, there's no team that like gets that juice flowing. Maybe the Celtics sometimes, but not really. So to have this built in now, I think is wonderful. Speaking of wonderful, John Gonzalez, you're a wonderful man. I appreciate you so much for hopping on the Coming In for a Landing podcast. You can check out all of John's work. Of course, the senior writer now at Sports Illustrated. You can find him on Twitter. What is it now? Is it at John Gonzalez? Is that still a thing?
It's at John Gonzalez. It's my name. And then a new episode of Sports Illustrated Weekly every Wednesday, available wherever you get your podcasts, all kinds of stuff.
Love it. John, thank you again. I appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you for checking out the Coming In for a Landing podcast. Please rate, subscribe, download wherever you get your podcast. I am your host, Paul Hudrick, and I will talk to you guys next time.